All right, I'm gonna get started here. Sorry, I was on mute. So good afternoon, everyone. This is our third webinar in the 12th Annual SEEK Forum. And this is Sustainable Procurement Opportunities for Local Government, featuring 4 organizations: ProspectSV, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Zero Net Energy Alliance, and Energy Solutions. This year's forum is sponsored by 3C Ren, Bay Ren, and SoCal Ren, along with Terra Verde Energy, the Energy Coalition, and TRC. Thanks so much to our sponsors for supporting our planning efforts this year. And of course, thank you to our promotional partners for helping us with outreach so that more local governments across the state can have access to each other and to each other's resources. I want to go over some quick housekeeping. Please be sure to use the Q&A box. You'll have an option to upvote questions you want to see answered. So at any point where you have a question, please do send that through the Q&A box. And the chat box is available for you too. Please do use this box to interact with other participants, introduce yourself, or you can reach out to SEEK staff like myself, Serena Soar, Gabby Yemeray, or John Vandervoort for any tech issues you may come across. And now I'd like to pass it on to our moderator for this webinar, Doug Davenport, who is the founder and executive director at ProspectSV Valley. Thanks for joining us, John.
Hello, good afternoon. It is an honor for us to be part of the SEEK Forum. Thank you so much for inviting us. We're excited to tell you about a program that we are running as partners in a grant-funded CEC project called Empower Procurement. Today, I am very happy to be working alongside Dr. Christopher Payne from Berkeley Lab, Richard Schorske from the Zero Net Energy Alliance, and Renee Lefrenz of Energy Solutions. They will be introducing themselves in their own little slides. We can go forward. So Empower Procurement, I'm going to give you just a few slides to give you an idea of what this effort is about. And as my partners speak about individual efforts we've been undertaking, we want to show you kind of where local government can be found in the lessons we are learning. This is, and you can move forward, this is an effort that's focused on, next slide, please. This is an effort that's focused on a really critical aspect of getting lower carbon, more sustainable, clean energy products kind of in our world, and that is procurement. That process alone is as complex as anything you can imagine once you get into it, as we all can attest. But as you can see, the bottom line for sustainability really kind of takes place in a lot of different areas of spending, whether that's IT spending or the service contracts or your fleets or your buildings or other kinds of products. There's a lot that can be done to reduce carbon footprint. We are fundamentally looking at how procurement processes and how procurement organizations could improve their approach and their outcomes on the sustainability front. Next slide, please. As we look at this, we've been challenged with the idea of what could be accomplished at scale statewide. We broke down the problem into some kind of major areas that we call procurement initiatives. We're looking at the procurement of products and services as it pertains to energy, the use of contracts and the use of contract specifications, asset management, including fleets, and as you'll hear, a new area of decarbonized buildings, and then the process of benchmarking and how benchmarking can facilitate improvement over time. As far as sectors are concerned, what you'll hear today is really dealing with the university system, with the University of California, CSU, and community colleges, school districts, specifically around school buses, and then local governments, you. We're also looking at other sectors in the future, but everything we're learning has a lesson to be applied to how local government is looking at its own sustainability bottom line. Next slide, please. So just a quick couple of notes on what we've learned to date at a top level before I introduce our first speaker, Chris. We we went out and surveyed 110 buyers in the state of California, both private sector and public sector. And what we found as we asked lots of different questions about their process and some of their barriers, where there was 4 major things that stood out. A lack of institutional capacity to really kind of make changes to clean energy products and services, or make changes to improve. 2, sometimes ambiguous or even contradicting rules internally about how to prioritize clean energy products over short-term savings. 3rd, insufficient information or even incongruent information amongst players. And then, as you might imagine, lack of buy-in. We see these as kind of major areas to take a look at, and we kind of affectionately call this roles, rules, and tools. And this is something that Berkeley Lab has applied across the federal sector, and we're very proud to be moving that idea forward. Next slide. So just a couple of slides. I hate to bore you with charts already, but hey, if somebody's got to do it, I'm glad it could be me. 2 big things you might see yourself in. When we looked at that buyer survey, 1 was around where the bottlenecks were. You might identify to this. Number 1 was gaining approval. Just getting through an approval process can be difficult, especially if you're making a change from one product to another, especially if those are major systems. Having appropriate contract documents and legal review came in a close second. These are things that we know can be difficult, and we're looking at how we actually kind of, let's say, cross the gap when it comes to information and in order to get those kinds of approvals and involvements moving forward. Incidentally, these beautiful graphs and other information are available through a published work that my colleague Taylor will be sharing to the chat. This was work that was published by Berkeley Lab and would be available to you to download. Let's go to the next slide real quick. So another area beyond process bottleneck is just what factors really get in the way of purchasing clean energy technology. One is first cost versus a really long ROI. You also see other issues here that you can peruse for yourself, that a lack of financing options can get in the way of actually buying down some of that first cost and can be a hindrance to people even moving forward. Again, institutional buy-in, whether that's at top management or at staff, become an issue, as well as just a perception of whether the technology is ready, reliable, maintainable, or will be a permanent solution for them, or a permanent change can be a real issue. So these gives you an idea of some of the things top level. What we're going to dive into here is, as we've looked at these individual sectors and worked with real people in the field, we've started to find some patterns that we believe apply to the local government sector as well. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Chris Payne. He's a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and a long-term friend of ours. And we're very excited for him to talk about his work with major institutions in the areas of overall practices and contracts. Chris?
Thank you, Doug. Next slide, please. So one of the things that LBL has done with regard to this project is try to understand the internal barriers that many organizations face to being able to achieve objectives related to sustainable acquisition and clean energy technology adoption. And so to do that, we've interviewed people in a number of contexts. We've looked at people in procurement roles within organizations, but also within energy and sustainability roles within those organizations, to understand how they're perceiving the process of acquiring and using these clean energy technologies. Next slide, please. So in this work, we've identified a few organizational barriers that we think are quite common. This work was done particularly in the University of California system, but we believe these are fairly generic. We've seen it in other organizational contexts as well. One of the first problems we see is a lack of clear and consistent policy language that drives sustainable acquisition. So it's really important that organizations that have sustainability goals have clear directives to their staff that outline the need for procuring sustainable products as part of achieving those sustainability goals. A second issue is a lack of clarity and specificity when one goes to actually try to procure those clean energy technologies. So, it's a common statement that I make: you won't get what you don't ask for, right? So being able to be precise about what you're trying to acquire is really key to making sure that your vendors provide that. A third big area of barrier that we've identified in organizations is a lack of access to their procurement data, and sometimes a lack of procurement data itself. So understanding, well, what are you buying as an organization, and how could that change over time? Getting access to and use from that procurement data is really important. And finally, one of the things related to that procurement data, we've often seen that there are barriers within the electronic procurement systems that are used to actually initiate these purchases that keep sustainable clean energy technologies from being acquired. And so reducing the barriers in those electronic systems themselves can really have a big impact in achieving the sustainability objectives. Next slide, please. So those were examples from our research in sort of organizations generally and trying to identify organizational barriers. We have a second procurement initiative specifically around the process of contracting and the acquisition documents and acquisition language that's used to procure clean energy technologies. And one of the key things we've seen there is that it's really important to be specific in the acquisition documentation to make sure that you're getting the technologies that you want. So being clear in the statement of work that energy efficiency or sustainability is important to you, that the vendor should provide those products or services. Making sure that the technical specifications of the document clearly identify sustainable products. Making sure that the evaluation factors that are used to judge the vendor that will be used to provide the product or service incorporate sustainability metrics. Making sure that when you're thinking about things like life cycle cost or best value procurement requirements, the process by which you calculate best value is clear and consistently applied. And finally, submittal requirements, making sure that what you requested in all of your contracting documentation is what is provided by the vendor at the end. And so making sure that as you're contracting with the vendor, you're requiring them to provide you with information about the environmental attributes of the products you're purchasing. That's a key issue. Next slide, please. So those were our two procurement initiatives that LBL is most heavily involved with: the practices or internal organizational dynamics of an organization, and the contract language specifically. And I'll now turn it over to my colleague Renee to talk about the procurement initiatives that her organization leads. Take it away, Renee.
Thanks, Chris and Doug. It's been a pleasure working with you both, as well as Richard and LGC on Empower Procurement. I am Renee LaFrenz, Senior Manager with Energy Solutions, and we've been a key partner on Empower Procurement, spearheading 3 of our procurement initiatives. And tune in, because these initiatives are geared for you, for local governments. So we're very interested in sharing what we've learned, and also an opportunity for you to benefit from these services and this grant. So first of all, next slide. First is our products procurement initiative, and this wheel on the right, you should look familiar. Doug teed it up during his Empower Procurement intro, and the products procurement initiative is one of the 6, again, that we'll be covering with you today. And the products procurement initiative is summarized on the next slide, and has been next slide, please. And has been focused on cities in particular. The benefits to cities, municipalities, we've worked with a few pilot clients to start, providing a free assessment to learn more about procurement processes, who's involved, what the barriers are. And, we're learning firsthand, that, one size doesn't fit all. There are some common barriers. They're covered in the published article. I encourage you to take a look at it. The Taylor linked in the chat. But this procurement initiative allows us to drill in with one-on-one with cities in order to identify and tailor resources that can help with specific barriers that cities face. So we are developing these resources and posting them as they become available on empowerprocurement.com. So plug to stay in touch with Empower Procurement, easy to remember, empowerprocurement.com. And this particular procurement initiative has to do with how products are purchased and who is involved in that approval pipeline. Are the processes you have in place conducive to folks only seeing products that are approved for use at your city? Are there electronic platforms that could help a city? And if you already have a platform in place, is it being used effectively? And what our role is here by performing these assessments, learning about barriers, and providing recommendations, which may include technology solutions or even organizational recommendations, is to provide complementary consulting to really identify and address those procurement barriers. On the next slide, you'll see that one of the first cities we worked with, San Luis Obispo, smaller city, 45,000 on California's central coast, home to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Working with this city, we interviewed stakeholders from procurement, sustainability, and the IT department. And so we focused in our identification of barriers and subsequent recommendations on IT purchasing. So we analyzed, they provided us with past purchase data for their IT department, including computers, monitors, that sort of thing. And we developed detailed recommendations for them, based on what we saw them buying and layered on our own, research, whether, having to do with cost, how it was bought, when it was bought, time of year, that sort of thing. It's worth noting that we put the asterisk on because this was done during 2020. So buying patterns were a little affected by COVID, as I'm sure you can all relate. Was able to wrap up this engagement with San Luis Obispo with recommendations for their future buying, as well as an impacts analysis if they implement these recommendations. Next slide, please. Services procurement initiative is similar to products. However, we take the lens of identifying the service contracts. And in this case, it's service contracts and how those vendors are making their purchases. On the next slide is a summary. You'll see this procurement initiative also included an assessment to start with representatives from the city, and included tailored resources, same model, and streamlined access to information, resources developed, posted on empowerprocurement.com. And again, as part of our recommendations, we wanted to include an analysis of the processes in place and solutions, including technology solutions relating to, in this case, qualified service providers, different than the other case, which is how products were being purchased by the city. In this case, so selection of your vendors. So on the next slide, you'll see a case study. We worked with Cupertino as one of our first cities, 58,000 smaller city located in Silicon Valley. Our stakeholders in this case were from the sustainability department, which interestingly is reports to their city manager, public works, finance, and contract services. We interviewed these key stakeholders and to learn about how they select service providers, and subsequently made recommendations about their selection process, their RFP process. You can probably relate to this, have very complicated insurance requirements. And our recommendations focused around the way they publish and respond to RFP submittals, how they can provide more information and open doors for smaller bidders to make their insurance requirements. And we also made a recommendation in this case about a bit of a reorganization and considering of a procurement officer, which some cities are lucky to have. It's harder when you're in the population 58,000 or so. And we heard from our key stakeholder at Cupertino, it helps to have a report in hand, recommendations in hand from, an outside group like ours with the name of the California Energy Commission behind us, recommending a procurement officer for their city. So that was great to hear that positive feedback from one of our cities. Next up, and this is an open opportunity. Although we are still accepting limited spots for, if you're interested in the types of assessments I just covered, I will put my contact information in the chat. This next opportunity, our Ebuildings initiative, there's an opportunity in 2 weeks at this very conference for you to get involved. What is it before you sign up? The Ebuildings Procurement Initiative is new. We're launching it in at this conference, as I mentioned, and we're hoping to take a different tack. The previous examples were one-on-one, hands-on with cities individually. For our Ebuildings and electrification initiative, we will be working with a group of cities and to align and provide strategic planning resources around how to get electrification planning enacted, started, wherever you are on your electrification journey, really, at your city. So on August 17th, there'll be more information on a slide coming up. We're going to start with, here it is, preview, but if you could go back to the last slide. We're going to be providing a case study from the city of Berkeley, who's worked closely with their CCA, East Bay Community Energy, to give you the good, the bad, the ugly on how they have shaped their electrification planning, what they've achieved, what challenges they encountered, so that you can get a taste for a city that's further along, perhaps, than you are in electrification planning. We want to work with cities in a group fashion so that you can share, commiserate, identify your challenges relating to implementing and convening the right people for electrification strategic planning. And we want to track and share best practices. Again, City of Berkeley will be sharing their lessons learned in 2 weeks. and build a collaboration network, which is why we're hoping to treat this more as a group effort, so that we're learning from you, and then Empower Procurement will be using these grant funding in hand from the California Energy Commission to develop resources, strategic planning templates. We want to hear from you. What would be beneficial to you. So if on the next slide, you'll see the agenda for the August 17th event. It's a lunchtime interactive session with the best practices and then guided discussion. You can meet one another. We'll have a very open chat activity and a shared whiteboard for all participants. And you will get the golden ticket invitation for a follow-up event hosted by Empower Procurement to be a part of this network we're going to build around electrification planning. And we see a lot of benefits with, we can help provide the coordination and, keep you in touch with your city counterparts so that, you can share your best practices, share the challenges. So we'd like to help with that coordination aspect. So if you haven't already, please register. I think, Gabby, thank you for including that in the chat. Please attend that event. I'll also put my contact information in the chat because these 3 procurement initiatives are tailored for local governments, and we'd love to keep the conversation going. So without further ado, I will pass the floor, next slide, to my colleague, Richard.
Thanks so much, and appreciate the introduction. I'm the founder and executive director of the Zero Net Energy Alliance and our sister nonprofit, which is the Electric Vehicle Alliance. And we are the proud sponsors of the EFleet Procurement Initiative, which is focused on electric vehicle fleet procurement with a focus on public fleets. Next slide. And what we are offering is, next slide, an address to what we're calling an EFleet Accelerator, which is fundamentally a way to enable public fleet operators to understand the costs and the opportunities in rapid transition to electric vehicles within their fleets. And as you probably know, state mandates for fleet transition are already in place in the public transit bus sector, in the truck sector. There's talk of a complete phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles in the state by 2035. There's also a movement to accelerate that target. I believe Massachusetts accelerated that target to 2030. So basically, internal combustion engine vehicles are going the way of the dinosaur. And most fleet types now have the opportunity to look at electric options in virtually every area of light, medium, and heavy duty, including off-road equipment, specialty vehicles like refuse trucks. Essentially, there's pretty much electric options across the board, which one couldn't say even 12 months ago. So our focus in the accelerator is to actually look at the institutional barriers to fleet procurement, the economic barriers, and to provide 2 levels of assessment and planning. One is a kind of a light touch readiness assessment to basically look at your fleet composition, give you some general idea of cost for vehicle replacements and overall infrastructure in a kind of a generic way without going into the particulars of your depot setting and electrical service and that level, which involves engineering assessments. But it will give you and your team a way to actually frame up for decision makers, what is the journey to electrification? What are the planning steps required? Roughly speaking, what are the operating and capital cost implications? And then a more in-depth dive is the EFleet transition plan. And this is for organizations that are definitely moving forward with EV in the near future or have already begun acquisition of EVs. And that's a much more granular plan, takes a few months to put together typically, and does involve analysis of your specific vehicle types and infrastructure needs. Next slide. And all of this is made available at this point through the CEC resource. And typically, if you go out to consultancies for EFleet plans, you're looking at 30 grand to 300 grand for a fleet transition effort, depending on whether you're talking about dozens of vehicles to hundreds of vehicles. So the barriers, I think, are pretty well understood by folks that have been working already on their fleet transition. But of course, upfront capital costs for the electric infrastructure and the charging infrastructure are pretty substantial. The countervailing element is that both utilities and various state grant programs, including formula grants for vehicles and sometimes competitive grants for infrastructure, are all available to substantially defray that cost. And exactly how much can be defrayed is a matter of some complexity, but there's a lot of resources available in the state, and there's going to be a lot more likely as soon as the budget process is complete. But CEC is looking at adding roughly $1 billion to the charging investment in California over the next few years. So we're talking about a lot of resources being available there. We also look at selection of vehicles, equipment, and ownership models. Not only are there typical leasing versus buy decisions, but there's also an emerging as-a-service model that can bundle everything, bundle infrastructure, bundle vehicles, bundle energy costs, and even fleet management, depending on what is desired. But those offerings are typically provided on a per vehicle mile basis or by the kilowatt hour if you're doing the charging approach. That includes the charging service and the energy bundled with that. So there's a lot of new models out there that can be relatively easy on a capital budget and integrate with current fleet budgeting norms. So obviously, identifying internal champions and the resources to move the projects forward is a critical factor that we look at with our fleet clients, and also looking at, are your climate and clean energy goals aligned with both current state policy and emerging state policy? We do expect a mandate on school bus electrification soon. And so that's a typical type of thing that we look over the horizon at what's coming down the pike. Next slide. So on the capital cost front, there's no question that many EVs are still higher on a first cost basis than internal combustion engine vehicles, and that the charging infrastructure adds a lot of cost and complexity. Typically, you're looking at $10K or so for a level 2 charger, and upwards of $50K or so for a fast charging installation. But those, of course, then would serve a generation or two of vehicles, at least as far as the basic infrastructure is concerned. So amortizing and how you budget and think about the costs of one-time charges for depot electrification is part of the game of presenting a full fleet electrification plan. On the solution side, as I mentioned, both CEC and CARB have grant programs. The local Bay Area Air Quality Management District has programs. They come in and out, but they're generally available for fleets. They have a lot of local government fleet priority for their programs. Low carbon fuel standard operated by CARB actually has enough resource in it to pay for the energy cost of the vehicle if you are sourcing your electrons from renewable sources. And so that's an interesting dynamic where you can almost write transit agencies that have solar or 100% renewable service are often getting their energy effectively for free because of the high value of the low carbon fuel standard. The HVIP is the medium and heavy duty incentive. Those can fund, and typically do fund, 100% of the incremental cost difference between electric and standard vehicles, and those are first come, first serve. The fund is re-upped every year, and then you have to get your application in early in conjunction with your vehicle dealer, and that will effectively levelize the cost of medium and heavy duty vehicles versus fossil fuel. All of the utilities have programs. The major utilities have infrastructure programs that are increasingly robust. Typically, the service upgrade, which is essential for most installations, is a matter of negotiation. There's no simple formula. They will look at your site and say, we'll do this amount and then you'll do the rest. And just a warning, it's typically an 18-month process to get a service upgrade from the beginning of the conversation. So this is not the kind of thing where you order the vehicles and then call your utility. This is something you really have to think through long in advance and go through that negotiation process. The local CCAs, Peninsula, Silicon Valley, Sonoma, all of the ones in the region are typically getting in the game with infrastructure and or vehicle incentives. So they vary by organization, but oftentimes they're favoring public fleet investment as well. And then many of you have heard of Electrify America. They are making their own decisions about infrastructure siting, but it's providing a lot of fast charging infrastructure in particular, that some of which is available for fleet use. So that's something to keep track of. And what we do is basically look at all of those sources, what's available and on tap now, and what's reasonable to expect might be covered in your particular situation. Next slide. And estimating the savings, costs and savings of a fleet electrification plan is not super simple, because you really have to consider, again, that amortization period of your capital expense for the charging infrastructure and how that gets funded. But we do have a pretty sophisticated model for the actual operating costs of the vehicles, and can customize, looking at vehicle by vehicle, what is your replacement schedule for vehicle X, when can that be turned into an electric vehicle, what's the used car value of that vehicle. Those kinds of things are all necessary to assess what's the full cost of the transition. There's a lot of variability in terms of when and how you charge that actually affects both capital and operating costs. So there's some really interesting smart charging management platforms out there. One that was supported by Prospect Silicon Valley and their accelerator is called Electrify. They help basically streamline the amount of charging that you actually need to install by considering how your charging will occur on a 24-hour cycle, so that you don't necessarily need as much power or as many chargers as would be the case without a sophisticated analysis of your exact routing and charging needs. Integration of solar and energy storage is a big piece of what can be done, and usually is advisable when you're doing a major installation, because the solar and the storage can minimize your demand charges on your utility bill, which can be really, really high when you add EV. There's also special EV rates if your charging is limited to overnight, but they're not always applicable depending on your fleet type. So we look at all of that, and we look at your TCO and take into account the fact that, we've had, just as an example this year, 30–40% of the cost of the diesel fuel's gone up, I think 30% this year. So electric goes up typically 3% a year, a little bit more in California, so it's a little cheaper. And next slide. So I'm going to just wind this up here, so we have some time for questions. But there's a set of providers that can do a limited amount of site walks and engineering review on their dime, but a full-scale load study and infrastructure assessment typically will cost some funding, and is ultimately needed to fill out the full planning process. And why don't I just mention that we do have a peer forum for public fleet operators that Prospect Silicon Valley operates, and it's really, really helpful to hear from colleagues who have gone through the process already and can kind of point out some of the challenges and opportunities involved. We're available through Prospect if you're interested in a fleet assessment of any kind, and look forward to engaging in the Q&A. Thank you all.
So I'm going to kick us off with some Q&A. So I'm going to turn to one of our speakers, one of our partners in Empower Procurement, Chris Payne, to start. So Chris, you've looked at this problem for some time, and by some time, I mean a long time, in the federal sector. And the federal sector enjoys some some advantages here in that there's centralized leadership and at least in some ways, maybe more centralized control over what gets bought. But I am certain that the challenges are similar for federal sector agencies as we would see in local governments here. And I was wondering if maybe you could just for a bit, just chat a bit about what you learned in the federal sector that you think is especially applicable here for the local government sector.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Good question. I'm not sure if I'm showing up on screen, but I think, one of the things that I note in the now 30 years I've been doing this procurement work in the federal sector is the impact that our day-to-day procurement decisions have on overall energy management and obviously carbon management eventually. And I think we often forget that, as government agencies, we have enormous market activity going on every day, and making choices that try to move us toward our sustainability goals can be really important in that context. And in fact, making choices that don't move us that way can be counterproductive. And so one example I have of that is work that we've done to try to evaluate whether the federal government is meeting its own federal legal requirements around procuring energy efficient products. And research at LBL suggests that the federal government buys energy efficient products as required by federal law roughly half the time. So what does that mean? It means that the policy of purchasing efficient products is not enough to enable the actual practice of buying efficient products. And so I think this focus on, as you mentioned earlier, Doug, the idea of organizational roles, rules, and tools. Who's involved? What are the policies in place? What are the systems in place that guide purchasing? Those are very important in shaping outcomes. And so for local governments in California, if we want to achieve sustainability objectives, we have to focus on these day-to-day purchasing practices that we follow to make sure we're getting the right stuff and allowing that to achieve our objectives. So that's what I take away from the federal sector and how I believe it can apply to the local government sector.
And these, I know we've been talking about what at times seem like fairly mundane changes, right? But when you look at those at scale, when you look at that across all local governments in California, if you look at that across all campuses of the University of California, you look at that across all schools in the school systems across the state of California, these are big impacts. Collectively, these ideas could permanently reduce thousands of tons of carbon and millions of dollars in cost. So these are big deals that have to be consistently applied time and time again across every organization to get the kinds of results we're talking about. Is that fair, Chris?
I think that's exactly right, Doug. And I think there's sort of a spectrum that I'd like to think about. On the one end of the spectrum is the sort of day-to-day purchases that we make just as part of our operational practices. Buying the replacement light bulbs as they burn out, buying the new water heater as the old one fails, buying the IT equipment that we use day in and day out in our work, right? Those are things that we're doing as a regular practice, and they're ways that inefficiency and high carbon output can slip into our organizations, right? So that's a place to sort of plug the leak, if you will, of high carbon use. And then the other end of the spectrum is some of the new technology adoption, some of the things that Renee and Richard have talked about, things like, well, how do we transition to electric vehicles? How do we move toward electrification of our buildings? And there again, the policy goals of making that happen can be shaped the outcome of those goals can be shaped by how we do the buying. And so thinking about making sure that we're asking for the right products and working with experts like Renee and Richard in helping us acquire the right products is really key to making that clean energy transition.
Great, I really appreciate that. So this question is really for everyone here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So Renee, Richard, Chris, and I'll chime in where I feel appropriate. I'd like to acknowledge Crystal for this question. In short, where to start? There's a lot of options here. We just created this big, as I call the cheese wheel of procurement measures, whether you're talking about your centralized, practices, if you're focusing on products or your services, your fleets, or your buildings, or your contractors or your contracts themselves. What's the starting point? How do you feel about this? Maybe some comments, maybe starting with Renee, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. And how do I start with answering you, Crystal? You have to start with looking at what processes you already have in place. And so the 3 initiatives that do that have that baked in are the practices initiative, and then the first 2 I covered, products and services. And so what those initiatives do, I mentioned the assessments. We have very targeted questions to suss out, who is making these approvals, where these barriers are, what technology solutions you have. Are they working? Do people use them, or are they such a hassle that they bypass the buying platforms and go to Amazon? Those are that's the baseline, so that you can set, what's already happening, where the problems are. And that's where we can come in, really to get out that information. We're interviewing the people that know that, because not all cities have a procurement officer in place. Most don't. The big ones do, and that's great. Someone with that job description. But as you could tell in my presentation, we had to interview people from different departments, because they all have a hand in procurement. It's, not the case where there's just one person making these approvals, making these purchases. So your baseline is where you want to start. And again, practices, products, and services are the initiatives that help you with that baseline, because we have an assessment developed, vetted, and has been used on a handful of cities so far. So that's where I would suggest starting. But if you are a city that already knows e-fleets are your priority, your mayor's priority, you could go straight there. So I'll be interested in hearing what Chris and Richard and Doug have to say, but I strongly suggest, whether it's a baseline assessment through Empower Procurement, or one that, you do with your colleagues, but, just see how these purchases are being made to start, and where those pain points are.
Great. Richard, thought?
Yeah, I think to the extent that you have a climate action plan that may have already done an inventory of municipal or county emissions by area of your public works, buildings, fleet, and so forth, that's a good place to start, just in terms of internal prioritization. Fleets typically have a fairly substantial impact if it's a larger fleet. And of course, buildings is right up there. So, those are 2 areas that are obvious. And one of the things that a lot of municipalities have done is converted to 100% renewable electricity, which helps magnify the benefits of fleet electrification, and of course impacts building emissions as well, in terms of moving from natural gas to electric infrastructure in your buildings. So, an easy low-hanging fruit is the 100% renewable option that most of the load serving entities are providing these days, and then just checking on your EFleet data if you've been using the EFleet format, and just taking a swing at the top level measures and looking at the relative costs of addressing those. And the process Renee described can give you some cost factors for the different domains of work that are potential. And of course, there's policy elements that can go along with the internal operations work. So as you know, we've done a lot of EV building code and other green building code policy work, and so has Energy Solutions. And that's an area where, you know, when you're doing internal ops, you can also look at the policy impact of some of these code upgrades that can really magnify GHG benefits for your community-wide Scope 3 emissions. So lots of opportunities, just keying off of the Climate Action Plan.
You know, one thing I want to sort of magnify from what Renee said, I think one of the important things about getting started with sustainable procurement or sustainable acquisition is realizing that it's a component of your broader acquisition practices, right? And so as a local government, you're already doing procurement. And the key is to think about how you can incorporate the sustainability into those practices that are already in place. And one of the things that I've seen that can be problematic is trying to implement policies that either parallel or in some cases conflict with some of those other active procurement activities. And so understanding your existing broad-based procurement practices and then working the sustainability within those, I think is a really good place to start.
Great. Really appreciate that. We have a little bit more time. I'm going to ask a kind of short-term, long-term question to Renee and to myself. So I'm going to answer the second half, but Renee's going to answer the first half. So the question, and this came from an attendee. Essentially, the question was how aligned were the recommendations and our observations in the local government work we did with their climate action plan goals? Or maybe another way to ask it is, were they thinking of implementing their climate action plan when they were speaking with you about the recommendations you were placing? That's the short-term question.
Yes, so in every city engagement that we have had the benefit of working with folks in the sustainability department who had a deep hand in climate action plans, and every city we've worked with has had a climate action plan. What, you know, we dug in a little bit during the assessment, but in our recommendation development process, you know, we took it upon ourselves to really read and understand the priorities of the city through the lens of that climate action plan, so that we're not providing recommendations over here in left field that aren't a priority to a city. So in our particular process, it went, you know, hand in hand. And so it came up in the assessment, and then, you know, was a constant reference when we were developing those recommendations. It had to be, because, you know, those climate action plans are, you know, active live documents. And so in at least one case, we were working with a relatively out of date climate action plan, and they were in the process of a new one. So there's always that. And, you know, so you all know better about the cadence of how often you update those. So we were a little hamstrung by, you know, the one in place at the time we were writing the recommendations. But yes, the short near-term answer is, you know, we used that as a key reference when we were making our priorities in the recommendations.
Right.
Doug.
So I said I would ask a long-term question, and I'm lobbing it to myself, and I hope my colleagues don't mind that. But the long-term question is really around what it takes tomorrow. So we just made recommendations today. What about tomorrow? What about the week after that? As Chris said, you can't just intend your way through this. You have to have consistency. You have to drive this across your organization. One way that we felt that we as a team could bring some scale to the implementation of what we recommend, and to socialize these observations and socialize these kind of recommended pathways, is to bring people together that all have the same problem. And that's what we call peer forums. Now, Richard mentioned peer forums as an element of what we do in Empower Procurement. We're especially excited about peer forums because it's a way to bring together, in this case, local government fleet managers that are all looking to respond to this opportunity to electrify their fleets. It's an especially difficult situation with local governments in doing so, but us holding up a sign saying, do it this way, or giving you a website that shows you some information on financing, doesn't make it immediately easier. There's a lot of complexity. And so bringing these people together as peers in a forum on fleet electrification gives them an opportunity to learn from each other. It gives them an opportunity to connect with information that we can provide, connect with tools that we can bring in, and connect with experts that legitimately care about how this gets done. We see this as a way to really kind of institute some of the long-term care and feeding that's needed beyond us finding a particular procurement barrier that we think is in common with a lot of cities or universities or schools, and get them really working with each other to address those problems. So we're excited about this. We're starting with the fleets peer forum with local governments, and I'm asking and thank you, Taylor, my colleague. He's put up a registration link. So if you're in a local government and if you're working in the area of fleet electrification and fleet management, please respond to this. Join this group. There will be events coming soon, and there's a lot of information and other tools available to you. Share that link openly with your colleagues. One last question, and I think I have to turn this back over to our friends at Local Government Commission here. Is there any constraint, bureaucratic, systematic, regulatory, et cetera, that you encounter that in a perfect world would disappear? If so, what is it? I mean, okay, y'all like down for another hour of discussion? Anybody want to take a stab at that? What's the constraint that if it went away, maybe would make life a lot easier? I'm going to guess it's not money.
Well, certainly lots of money never hurts, but I think the one thing that pops to my mind is the idea of sort of justifying life cycle cost effectiveness. That's one that I see all the time of,
yep.
Prove to me that this works. And to me, it's sort of the reverse. To me, it's prove to me why we shouldn't do these things, And in fact, in the federal government, that's what our policy now is. We've set the default so that a federal buyer has to show why they can't buy the efficient product and instead must buy the inefficient one rather than the other way around. So that's one example of a broader category that I would call default practices. And if we can get those defaults arranged so that the sustainable things are the default choice, the easy choice, that would be the perfect world that would move this stuff easily.
Great. So I fear that we're out of time. I just want to acknowledge Eleanor Oliver and Katrina Lenny-Koenig, our counterparts at the California Energy Commission that have worked with us closely over the last 2 years. We really appreciate the collaboration and the opportunity to run this program. With that, I believe I'm giving it back to Serena.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks to our panel for that discussion and sharing all these great opportunities with our local government audience. I want to give one more shout out to our sponsors and remind folks of our upcoming events. We have more events next week. And as Renee mentioned, their second workshop will be during week 3. Please do take our post-session survey for a chance to win a $50 gift card. This is a space for you all to give us feedback on how we're doing and what you would like to see. So thank you, everyone, and just have a great rest of your day.